Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anthropuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Michael Thomin. He graduated from the University of West Florida with a master's in public history, history of museology, and specialization in museum studies, as well as a bachelor's in history specializing in international studies. He currently works as a faculty research associate at the University of West Florida and as the museum manager for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a little rainy out here, but it's perfect weather for doing a podcast.
Yes, I totally agree. So we'll just jump right into it. But what exactly is a museum manager and what do they do?
Yeah, so sure. A museum manager is just like, I guess, any manager of any business, basically, or any other nonprofit organization. So my job duties are pretty wide ranging. I'm based out of our Florida Public Archaeology Network's coordinating center here in downtown Pensacola. So we're actually a statewide program of the University of West Florida, and we have offices throughout the entire state that all focus really on the same thing, and that's outreach and education, getting people involved in archaeology. But here at our coordinating center, we also have a museum. And so one of my many responsibilities is to manage that museum. So I supervise our graduate students who work down in our museum. I oversee programs and events and different projects that we do through our museum. I help to curate exhibits or help students to develop exhibits that highlight different work that is being done, not just here in Pensacola, but throughout the entire state of Florida in terms of our archaeological resources. And then I also work with many different partners to fulfill all those duties. So I'll work with other University of West Florida partners like the UWF Archaeology Institute, the UWF Historic Trust, which manages many different historic properties here in downtown Pensacola, including a few different museums. But I'll also work with other partners and collaborate with other organizations, whether it's municipally owned museums, privately owned museums, nonprofits. I often work with federal agencies like Gulf Islands National Seashore. We do a lot of different programs with them. We also work with Florida state parks as well as county and city entities as well. So we always kind of joke that in the museum world, you wear many different hats. And so here, I think I pretty much do every aspect of doing museum work in general. So from, again, like I said, from exhibits, but also to fielding phone calls for information, whether it's from someone from the general public who's just interested in like what our museum hours are, or if it's someone who's made some sort of archaeological find, like an artifact, and they're wondering, what do I do with this thing? So it's a broad job. But yeah, I think every day is always a little bit different. So.
Okay. And how often does that happen that someone calls in and they're like, hey, I think I found something?
Pretty frequently. I mean, a lot of times it's just like an email. I'll give you two examples. I had last week, I was doing a ferry tour. Pensacola has a ferry that ferries people basically to Gulf Islands National Seashore to Fort Pickens area. And their interpretive ranger, Kaz Rozecki, he had reached out to me and my colleague, Nicole Granan at the UWF Archaeology Institute to do an underwater archaeology tour of Pensacola Bay on this ferry. So we did the tour. And then after this tour, this lady who was on the tour came up to me and said, I had something wash up on my property and I wanted to know like what it is. And so I told her, best thing to do is take a picture of it with something next to it for scale. And I gave her my card and I just told her, email me. Well, sure enough, a few days later, she emailed me a photograph of it. And it's basically a large piece of wood with some iron fasteners in it. And so it could be from a more modern dock. I've sent it around to some of my colleagues to get their different opinions on it. But, stuff like that happens fairly frequently. Other times we'll have people who will come in our museum and they'll have sometimes boxes and boxes of artifacts that a recently deceased loved one used to collect. And they're wondering, what do I do with all this stuff? And that's a much more complicated situation. And then other times, yesterday, I got a call from a gentleman who he's actually called me several times, as well as several other of our offices around the state, making making some pretty extraordinary claims about finding the lost fleet of Atlantis on the coast of Florida. And he's convinced that he's found it, and he's got all these YouTube videos online about that. So I've had a couple different conversations with him, and he's convinced of that. That's what it is. But so, yeah, I mean, it runs the gamut, and again, that's all within like the last week or two. So it's not something that happens every day, but it certainly comes up. There was a period of time, and for me, I've been working in museums for almost 2 decades now, and it seems to me that it's becoming a more frequent issue in terms of people with box loads of artifacts that their grandfather or mother or father used to collect, and they don't want it. They don't want their stuff, but they don't know what to do with it. And so it's becoming a huge problem. Collections facility. Luckily, we are not a collections facility. Our museum's a little bit different because we don't maintain a collection. Most of our artifacts that we have on display are actually on loan through the state and some through the UWF Archaeology Institute. The Institute does have a collections facility on our main campus. So usually what will happen in that situation is I'll reach out to the collections manager, and then we'll come up with a plan if someone is like insistent on bringing in artifacts. And sometimes they dump it off on our doorway at night, and that causes all sorts of issues as well. So, but I think it's becoming increasingly a problem, and I think part of it is related to these people who used to collect, 30, 40 years ago are aging out or passing away, and their kids, they don't want their crap is what it is. It's always interesting, but I'd say for the most part, it's like that lady who approached me at the ferry. They just found something and they're just curious about what it is. So, yeah.
Oh, cool. I know a lot of times whenever I did, like when I was in university, and I had a shipwreck archaeology class, and she was like, if you find something, don't touch it. Like, leave it where it is, especially if it's like arrowheads and stuff like that, because you're not supposed to touch those kind of things. You're supposed to just leave them where they are. But what's the weirdest thing that someone's brought in? Because I know some people, like when I was taking biological anthropology, they'd have like full-on skeletons, like bones, like somebody collect finger bones. Like, what's the weirdest thing that you guys have had brought in or mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point too, and that's something that we always try to explain to people who do bring these things in. Is of course, we want to know, obviously, like where they found it, because if it's found on state lands, including state waterways, and any navigable body of water in the state of Florida, whether it's a stream, river, lake, Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic Ocean, up to a certain nautical miles out in the continental shelf, are all actually owned by the state of Florida. So it's actually against the law to disturb or remove artifacts from any state or federal lands. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. But also, if it's on someone's private property, it's a little bit different, with the exception of human remains. Regardless of where human remains are found, whether on federal, state, or private property, they're actually protected by state statute. And so we always try to explain this to people. And of course, if it's someone's own, if that's their actual property, their physical property, then with the exception of human remains, then it would actually belong to that property owner in the state of Florida. So this is something I think that there's a lot of people don't understand, and a lot of that comes from like metal detecting groups that we often have to communicate this to. So that's a really important point. And then also we say the same thing. We always advise people, wherever you find an artifact, leave it in place, take a photograph of it. Most people have smartphones now that have GPS locations. If your location services are on, then that metadata will give a GPS coordinates to exactly where that artifact is at. And then we always advise them to either, email an image of it to the land manager or to us, and then we can put them in, or a local university. So that's a very important point that we always try to get across anytime someone brings something in. But in terms of the weirdest thing that someone brought in, I don't know if I would call it weird, but we had, over a period of several months, we had several boxes of artifacts, mostly just plain indigenous pre-colonial sherds that were dropped off at our front door here at the FPAN Coordinating Center at our museum. And this went on for a couple months. I think we ended up with something like 50 or 60 boxes.
Wow.
And it wasn't just a lot of the material was here locally. And it was interesting because the individual who had collected these sherds had actually put whiteout on each individual sherd and then put a number. But we have no idea what that number means. There was no like information about what that number actually meant. And then within some of these boxes would just be like a legal, yellow notepaper pad that just said, the general location of where it was found. So on this particular one, it said East Bay. And East Bay is part of Pensacola Bay, and it's actually quite large. It takes up most of the southern end of Santa Rosa County. And so it's a huge area, so it doesn't give us a lot of good information about where exactly this material was found from. But also in some of these drop-offs, he also had material from Colorado, from New Mexico, from Georgia. And so we had to, it created a lot of issues for us because, again, we weren't a collections facility. But in finally, the last straw with this was when we were going through some of this collection that was dropped off, we did find human remains. And once that happened, then, we had to really, change an approach because we couldn't have this material coming in anymore because it violates all sorts of laws. And so eventually it stopped. We were able to figure out who it was and get in touch with them and say, please don't do this anymore. But that was probably, again, I wouldn't call it the weirdest thing, but that was probably the most serious thing that we had dropped off was, and again, it was just a piece of bone, but it was clearly human. And so, yeah, it's always bizarre that people collect human remains. There's a lot of ethical issues with doing that. There's, especially in the field of archaeology, there's a really kind of dark history of where these human remains came from and how they were treated. And a lot of them tend to be from indigenous groups, which, again, there's a long history in anthropology about mistreatment and misusing the discipline in that regard. That's caused a lot of the current issues we're dealing with in the field, and of not just anthropology and archaeology, but in the museum field. I mean, it's all directly related to that. But yeah, I'd say that was probably the most serious thing that we've had come in. A lot of the times, though, it's people will come in with just broken pieces of pottery and they just want to know, like, where did it come from? I think a lot of the people that do come in, at least willingly, they don't even know that there's laws that protect these materials. Like, they have no clue. I'd say like 95% of the people who I interact with, they just didn't know. But then you have that 5 or 10% that they absolutely know, and they're going to continue doing it because they think that they should just have the right that any artifact they find on public land is finders keepers, right, which is not the law, right? Finders keepers is not a legal offense at all. Like, if you tried to argue that in court, you're going to lose. Like every time. So it's a large part of what we do as an organization is public outreach and education. And a large part of our battle, at least since my time being within this field, has been trying to communicate that message. And the other part of it is just telling people that anthropology and archaeology aren't dinosaurs. Like, that's the other half of it, right?
And my friend wanted me to ask, how long does something have to be buried for it to be considered archaeology and not grave robbing?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, again, it brings up another really interesting point. In terms of what is considered archaeological, it depends, right? So the federal government, National Park Service, says 100 years or older, whereas the state of Florida, the statute that regulates and governs archaeological materials on public lands, on state lands, says 50 years or older. So it must be 50 years or older in the state of Florida to be considered archaeological. So in terms of grave robbing, I mean, that's another interesting question, right? Because I think it kind of depends, right? If you, part of it's going to be the country that you're in. If you look at Egypt, for example, they see no problem in excavating human remains and putting them on display. And that's within, that's part of their culture. That's something that they just do all the time. Here in the United States, more recently, the ethics of it has really shifted from, 100, 200 years ago, going and digging in an indigenous mound site that had, several hundred burials in it, and then putting that material on display was like just the thing to do. But now, especially after the passage of the NAGPRA, Native American Graves Repatriation Act of 1990, that has really shifted. And so there's really been a reckoning in the field, just in general, about in terms of the treatment of human remains and how that should be done. And in the state of Florida, we do have statute 872 that governs discovery of human remains and protections of all human remains and grave sites and associated grave goods. And so in the state of Florida, regardless of how old it is, regardless of the cultural affiliation, they are actually protected under state statute. With that said, there are sometimes when development that happens, sometimes these remains are removed and relocated, and sometimes that's not done properly. And what we're finding is that in many cases, 150 to 100 years ago, when cemeteries were relocated. They in fact weren't relocated, and it was purposely done, and they were purposely erased. And that's a big problem that the state is dealing with now, is knowing where exactly historic cemeteries are located at. We have a program called the Florida Historic Cemetery Inventory, where people can actually go online and they can report a local cemetery so the state actually knows about it. And what's really interesting is just because it's on Find a Grave doesn't actually mean it's in the state database. And it actually probably isn't, because these are two totally different databases that don't communicate with each other. So what we've been trying to do for the last few years especially is to get these cemeteries, whether they're marked or unmarked or known or not known, to get them recorded so that the state knows that they're there. Because oftentimes what will happen is, especially for historic cemeteries that may not have markers anymore, for whatever reason, the descendants maybe moved out of the area. Sometimes it was just because, there was a boom and bust industry. There's a community just north of us here in Pensacola called Muskogee that in the early 1900s was a booming lumber town. Hundreds of people lived and worked there and died there. And there was a cemetery that actually existed. But then that lumber boom ended because they basically cut down all the longleaf pine. I mean, within about 40, 50 years, it was pretty much gone. We only got about 2% of it left in the eastern United States. But because of that, town essentially disappeared. And so there's no real descendants that were there to kind of maintain and keep care of the cemetery. That's one reason why these cemeteries were not cared for anymore and kind of forgotten. The other reason that often happened was through Jim Crow laws and racial violence that forced Black communities out of the state to go up north because it got so bad. And so that's why we're seeing so many African American cemeteries, historic cemeteries, that were long forgotten and often purposely erased. And so it's important for us to get those documented and recorded. That way, if there is potential development in the future, and we're seeing a lot of development throughout the entire state of Florida, especially here in Northwest Florida, it's really starting to blow up in terms of development. If those developments don't know that cemetery is there, they're going to get impacted, even though there's laws that protect them. And so, and it's not just a Florida problem. This is a United States problem in terms of these, particularly African American cemeteries. But luckily, the state of Florida does now have a historic cemetery office that specifically deals with cemeteries throughout the state. They have staff now. They just started up about a year ago. They have grants that they give out every year now to do research, to do interpretation, to do conservation. It's something that took a lot of effort to fight for to get that. But now that we have it, hopefully people have another place to go if they are concerned about a local historic cemetery that they want to see preserved. But it's hard work. I mean, preserving cemeteries is like many staff here at the university and at Florida Public Archaeology Network. I sit on different boards, and one of the boards that I'm currently president of is St. Michael Cemetery Foundation of Pensacola, which we own and maintain Pensacola's oldest historic cemetery in the state of Florida. And it is some of the most rewarding work that I've done, but it's also some of the most challenging. So there's no easy solution. It's hard work, but it needs to be done. And human remains, regardless of how old they are, whether they're 50 years old, 100 years old, 5,000 years old, they should be protected and respected and treated all the same.
Yes, I agree. And there's another preservation thing that you're with as well, the Northwest Florida Maritime Landscape Alliance for Preservation, or MLAP. What is that?
Yeah, so MLAP, this is such a long name that we came up with. So, I have to kind of go back in time a little bit. So back in 2016, we hired a postdoc at Florida Public Archaeology Network, Dr. Swarna Hoxad, and she and I worked for about 2 years doing the first ever study of heritage tourism in Northwest Florida. So the first year of that, in 2016 to 2017, was all field work. So basically, we visited every single museum and historic site in Northwest Florida, basically from the Perdido River to the Apalachicola River, which is about 200 miles east to west. And so we met with different museum employees and managers, and we really tried to learn from them about, what they needed, what they were doing well, and what sort of resources they could use in the future, and how we can make heritage tourism more known and more sought after here in Northwest Florida. Because we know through heritage tourism studies that have been done for many, many decades now, that people who come for tourism to our areas, they often are coming for our beaches, right? That's why they're coming here for. But on the north end of our counties, they don't tend to get the same sort of visitation that our south south end of our counties do that have the beaches. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is because we have a lot of historic resources and museums that are on the northern end of these counties that we like to also benefit through the economic benefits that come through heritage tourism. And so after we did a year of field work and then we did a year of writing up, and basically what we found was two things, or a few things that I'll just highlight. We found a lot of things, but I'll just highlight a couple of them. The first thing we found was that about 1/3 of those 70, give or take, museums that we visited and surveyed and analyzed and assessed were considered small museums. And small museums are basically, they may have like one staff person that's paid. A lot of times, most of their staff are volunteer based. A lot of these small museums don't have recurring funding, right? So some of them may have some funding from like a county or a city, but most of them, it's literally they're sustained by donations, they're sustained by field trip programs, and they're sustained by people paying admission fees. And that's where the bulk of their funding actually comes from. So most of them don't have recurring funding. And the other thing we found is a lot of these small museums, they're all doing great work, right? I mean, it's very difficult work, but they were all really trying hard. But we found that a lot of the smaller museums, in particular here in Northwest Florida, didn't necessarily have backgrounds in museums. Like the person running the museum actually wasn't trained as a museum person. A lot of them were people who may have worked in education for 20 or 30 years and then retired, and now they're just doing this as, kind of something that they enjoy to do. But they didn't have that training. And not that you need training to do this thing, because some of the best museum employees and directors I've known are from small museums, right? They kind of learned on the job. And so I really respect them because I know how hard it is, because that's where I started, right? And so we found that they didn't necessarily have the training, they didn't have the resources, and they didn't necessarily know. There's actually a lot of grants out there through the state of Florida, but also through federal grants, through library services. There's tons of grant opportunities out there, but because they didn't have that training, they didn't really know where to start in terms of like how even to write a grant. And so through that, we found really that there was two main challenges, and that was obviously funding. Like everybody was like, we need more funding. And then the other thing was training, like how to write grants, for example. And so Sorna and I were trying to figure out like, okay, what's the solution here? How do we help these small museums in Northwest Florida? And so we looked around and we came across this federal program that's run through the National Park Service called National Heritage Areas. And National Heritage Areas it's not a unit of the National Park Service. It's actually a congressional designation. And one of the things that's really nice about getting this congressional designation is that it comes with recurring federal funding that you can use, as a lot of different National Heritage Area entities who manage their areas will distribute money to local museums or environmental organizations within the boundaries of that designated area as grants. So it essentially becomes this new source of grant funding that can just be used for a particular area. And the other thing that we saw as a benefit for becoming a National Heritage Area was that it came with advice and training from the National Park Service staff, if they wanted it, right? So those two issues that we found for small museums, funding and training, if we could get that congressional designation, would help to alleviate and solve some of those issues. So that was kind of what we had decided was like the best thing that we could do was try to get this congressional designation. So in 2018, after we did that heritage tourism study, Sorna had gotten funding through another center within the University of West Florida called the Askew Institute for Multidisciplinary Studies, or AIMS, to fund her for a couple years to try to get this designation. So we're still continuing to working on that. Most National Heritage Area, it's actually it's a congressional designation. So to get this designation, it literally takes an act of Congress. And so there are 62 National Heritage Areas currently in the United States. There are a couple in Alabama. I believe there's 2 in Alabama. Mississippi has 2. Florida currently has none that are exclusive in this state. And so we've been trying to become the first, and we're still working at it. What we found is most National Heritage Area designations take about 10 years. So it's a lot of work. And so anyways, getting to MLAP. So in order to get this National Heritage Area designation, the first thing you have to do is what's called a feasibility study. So you have to have lots of public meetings and public input. You have to it's kind of like getting a national landmark or national register nomination, except like on steroids. It's like 100 times harder to do, just because there's 10 different criteria that you have to prove why you should be become a national heritage area, why this particular area is worthy of this. And so it took several years just to do the study. Fast forward to 2020, we had done all of our community input. We'd been working on getting the study done, getting very close to it, and then COVID hit. Well, actually, I go back a little bit. The first big challenge we had was 2018, October 2018. On October 8th, 2018, Hurricane Michael hit. Category 5 hurricane that just devastated Bay County and a lot of the northern counties. So that really that impacted our ability to do these public meetings to get public input in these other counties that were affected from the storm, because some of them are still recovering from that, 5 years later or 6 years later now. So that was the first. And then the second thing was COVID hit in 2020. And when that happened, a lot of funding was cut by the university. And so the funding for that project was actually cut off in 2020 through the university. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? And we had all this buy-in from many different partners. We ended up getting 128 letters of support from local, state, even federal agencies. We had U.S. Department of Agriculture. We had a letter from FEMA because they saw the value of having this National Heritage Area designation, especially after disasters like when Hurricane Michael hit. But then we also had a lot of local museums. We had really there's so much excitement that we had generated from all of our different partners. And after that, when that happened, we had to reach out to them and say hey, we had that funding cut. We're trying to figure out how to keep this going. And basically what happened was all of our really strong supporters were like, we want to continue doing this. How can we form some sort of entity to keep it moving forward? And so based on conversations that we had with those partners, they decided basically we should create a nonprofit to keep this moving forward. And that's where MLAP was born. And so one of the main priorities of the Maritime Landscape Alliance has really been to keep moving this National Heritage Area effort forward. And because of that, late last year, we submitted the final study to the National Park Service, and it's actually currently under review with the National Park Service. But MLAP 2 is also focused on preserving not just cultural sites related to our maritime cultural landscape, which includes the entire watershed, right? I mean, all of our lands are connected to the water, whether it's through the creeks or rivers or the Gulf of Mexico or Santa Rosa Sound or many different estuaries that we have here in the Florida Panhandle. But we also have done a lot of work to making sure that we can advocate and preserve and keep those partnerships that we had built through our efforts with trying to get this National Heritage Area designation. So we're pretty active. I mean, one of our more recent, the National Heritage Area effort is a big one that we continue to work on, but also we're collaborative lead for another project that just wrapped up field work this past summer in Apalachicola called the People of the Apalachicola Project. As we are the collaborative lead on that, it was a grant that Nicole Grenan got through NOAA. We have been very active in partnering with that, in helping with field work, but also just helping in terms of collaborative efforts with all the different partners that are around that Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is actually a pretty big area overall around Apalachicola Bay. That's our main effort. That's really why we were formed back in 2020, is just to keep those partnerships moving forward and to eventually get that designation.
That's really cool. I honestly didn't know about this organization until I was doing research into what you do.
Yeah, we have a website. We have a Facebook page, so people can go and check out all the different things that we've been doing. They can learn more about national heritage areas and how they can really benefit communities at large. So
why did you get into museology?
Well, what's interesting is, my entire career, I've worked at basically archaeology museums, but that's not actually my degree. My degree was in public history and in maritime history, and I minored in international studies. When I finished my bachelor's degree in history, my plan was I wanted to be a history professor. I really even to this day, I love doing research. That's one of my favorite things, digging into the archives and the documents. I obsess over it. I can spend 10 hours going through handwritten letters from the 1700s, early 1800s, and just making these new discoveries through the archival records. But that's what I really kind of wanted to do. I was I want to be a history professor, and so the museum world was not really on my radar at all. And then so I finished my bachelor's degree, and I had gotten to know one of the professors who worked at University of West Florida at the time, Dr. Matt Clavin. He's still a history professor. He works out in Texas now. He was my advisor, and so I finished my degree, and then I was like, I'm going to do some traveling before like I get a 9 to 5 job. So I ended up actually going to Brazil for a couple weeks, and in that time frame, Dr. Clavin had emailed me and said, hey, I think like there's this job opportunity. He knew a person. He knew the curator at the Naval Aviation Museum, which is a national museum on Pensacola Air Station, which is a naval base in Pensacola. And he said, I think you'd be great for this job. And I was like, I never really thought about working in a museum before. So I was like, maybe like I'll give it a try. That job ended up not working out. The funding for that position actually ended up getting cut. And so anyways, but that kind of put museums on my radar. So I started to kind of go around to local museums as I was applying for grad schools. I applied to like UF and FSU because again, my goal was to be like a history professor at the time. I knew I'd probably take like half a year before I would get into grad school. So I was like, I need to do something until then. And so I was like, oh, I'll explore this and see what it's like. So I just went around to different local museums and just dropped in and just talked to different museum directors who were there. And one of the museum directors I had stopped at was the City of Fort Walton Beach Heritage Park and Cultural Center, which one of their main museums is called the Indian Temple Mound Museum. And right next to it is a National Historic Landmark and the largest pre-colonial indigenous mound site in Northwest Florida. That still remains. And it's a National Historic Landmark. It's a really important archaeological site too. And so I talked to the museum director and I just told her like, hey, I'm just interested in I was just basically telling her I could volunteer. And so she gave me her card, and about a week later, she emailed me and she said, hey, I've got a position that just opened up. And she said, you should apply for it. And so I did, and I ended up getting the job. And what was really great about that experience, the City of Fort Walton Beach Heritage Park and Cultural Center is a municipally owned museum. It's actually the first municipally owned museum in the state of Florida, but it's funded through the city. So I was actually working for what they at the time was the Parks and Recreation Department, and what's now I think it's called Parks and Cultural Services or something like that. But it was like such an interesting experience because not only did I get to see like the inner workings of local government, so not only did I get that local government experience, but because it was a small museum, I got to do basically everything, right? I mean, when you go to these larger institutions, if you do collections, that's pretty much all you do. If you do exhibits, that's pretty much your whole job. If you do education, that's pretty much all you do. If you do visitor services, that's pretty much it. So when you work at these larger institutions, your experience, although it's great experience, is kind of limited. If you work for a small museum, you do everything. So I did everything from field trips to exhibits to visitor services to education. At one point, the city made me like the community redevelopment agency marketing coordinator. So like I had 3 jobs basically. They're like, we'll give you a little raise and you could like help coordinate with the downtown merchants on like, promoting the museum and working with different businesses and nonprofits, right? That became so I basically did every single possible thing you could do in a museum over about a 4-year period. I did. And that really set me up to be perfectly suited for when this opportunity with the Florida Public Archaeology Network with my museum manager job. I think there were probably people that had experience that had applied for my job working at larger institutions. At the time, I only had a bachelor's degree, so I know people who applied for my job. I had master's degrees, but what they didn't have was all the experience that I had done. And it just turned out that's exactly what they were looking for my position, was someone that had all this breadth of experience, because that's my job is now to basically do all those things. But what I found too in those 4 years is that I really enjoyed it. Every single day was different. I still got to do research, for exhibits. I still got to do that historical research, and I'm still doing historical research for things like exhibits, but also as other projects come up too. So I just really fell in love with the field and the work, and I really believe in it. I think museums play such an important role in society, but also in local communities. Again, coming from a small museum, I know that a lot of rural communities, the only exposure some of these disenfranchised groups have is the local museums that they may go on a field trip with to when they're in 4th grade. Right. And that's like the only interaction they really get with cultural history and cultural objects is through that experience. So I think we can have an incredible impact on local communities, whether it's school kids, but also, people who are retirees or are just looking for something to do. Right. So I really came to not only love the work because every day was a little bit different and I'm passionate about it, but also because I think it does serve a greater good to our communities. I will say that, my museum title did just recently change. So I was museum manager here up until about a month ago, and I'm still doing my same job. I'm still running our museum and all the stuff that comes with that. But now we've reorganized our coordinating center a little bit. So now my title is the Director of Education and Interpretation for the entire state of Florida, or through FPAN. So, but I'm still doing my museum manager job. I got some extra duties.
Yeah. Do you ever get to do any like maritime studies? Because I know that was your main thesis that you wrote on, was maritime studies and pirates. Do you ever get to do any of that work anymore?
Yeah, one of the great things again, I wear many different hats. Like my working title for a long time was museum manager. My working title now is Director of Education and Interpretation. But my actual university job is called a Faculty Research Associate. And so one of the great things, and again, part of the reason why I wanted to be a professor of history, and now I don't want to be a professor of history. I'm like, I've seen what that actually is, and I respect them, but I was like, I don't want to grade papers. You know what I mean? But I love doing research, and so really, really, what I found was I didn't necessarily want to be a history professor. I wanted to work for a university. And when you work for a university, one of the ways you're evaluated each year is, because I am faculty. I don't teach classes formally or anything like that. I sat on a few different graduate thesis committees. So I do some of the similar things that if a professor would do, I just don't teach formal classes. Although sometimes I'll come in and do like a guest lecture for a class. But one of the things I've really loved about the university and working for a university and being a faculty member is that the way you're evaluated is like research publications that you're putting out there. So yes, we are encouraged and in fact evaluated every year on like how many conference presentations we gave, right? How many publications we've put out or submitted or had published. Because of that, part of my job is to do research. And so yes, one of the things I love about this job is it's enabled me to continue to research and publish on maritime history specifically. And so my interest has for a long time been piracy, particularly during the Age of Revolution. So, most people focus on the golden age of piracy, which was like, kind of give or take the early 1690s, and they generally cut it off about 1725. But what's been really understudied is 100 years later in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Sea. Like that period of piracy was actually, I would argue, worse than 100 years earlier when you had Blackbeard and Anne Bonny and Mary Read and Jack Rack, all those figures from the golden age. 100 years later, it was even worse in the Gulf of Mexico, and it lasted longer and it extended further. It wasn't just in Florida. It was in the Bahamas and Cuba, and then eventually extended down into South America, and really didn't end until about 1830, 1831, when Brazil had a war with Uruguay. It eventually became Uruguay. There was a war there, and they relied heavily on pirates and privateers, and so it was just this very long period of piracy. And so I've been studying that now for probably over a decade. I've published a few different articles, some peer-reviewed, some more like popular publications. But then we recently, because of that, I worked with one of my colleagues, Jess Craig, who's a curator of exhibits over at the UWF Historic Trust, who's also really interested in piracy and wrote her master's thesis about piracy and the naval squadron that kind of dealt with them. And so we co-authored a book chapter in the most recent Archeology of Piracy book that came out last year during International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So yeah, I still do research. It's not just piracy, so that's just something that I'm interested in. But I also publish on other subjects too, like museum studies, archaeology education, historic preservation, things like that. So we have to publish on more than just like our passion projects. But yeah, that's one thing that I've loved about doing this work. And in terms of maritime history, we had a former student, Bria Brooks. She just graduated with her master's degree. Now she's our public archaeologist for our Northwest region. So I work with her very closely now. But her master's thesis work was on a really significant maroon communities. The largest maroon community in what's now the continental United States was actually existed on the Apalachicola River. It's maritime history. And so I sat on her thesis committee, but I was able to help her with some research too. So yeah, I still get to do maritime stuff.
Well,
I should have an article coming out pretty soon in the Pensacola History Illustrated. There was a case of piracy that came to Pensacola in 1830, which I didn't know about until about a year ago. But that article will be coming out, I think, this month or maybe next month.
Okay. As a faculty research associate, what do those generally make, like salary-wise in a year?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends, really. So within the university, you have faculty. So that's like professors, assistant professors, associate professors. They tend to make a little bit higher, a little bit more on the pay scale than faculty research associates or adjuncts or lecturers do. We make less. And it's because most adjuncts and research associates don't have PhDs. Some of them do, but most of them don't. And so part of the pay is related to, especially within the university system, right? Within the university, it's very important to have a PhD. Not to say that you need a PhD to get a great job or to be very competent. I know people who have bachelor's and master's degrees who are actually doing pretty well working for like cultural resource management agencies in the private sector or even in federal government. You don't have to have a PhD to make a pretty good living within this field. But in terms of like faculty research associate, it kind of varies. The range, I'd say, is between like mid 40s to probably like mid 60s. Again, that's just kind of the nature of being within a university. Assistant professors won't make as much as like a tenured full professor, right?
Right.
So that's just kind of how it is. I mean, in the end, you'll make more money as a professor for sure. But you also have to deal with a lot of things I don't have to deal with, right? It's kind of nice, I mean, I love working with students. That's one thing that I also really love about being within the university system is I still get to work with students. I get to sit on thesis committees. I get to go and talk to them in classes or, I always encourage them. And a lot of students don't know that like research associates are faculty and can serve on your thesis committee. A lot of them don't know that. And so I always tell them I'm always happy to do that. But I love working with students, but I don't want to grade papers. I don't want to be worried about enrollment and all the stuff that comes with it. There's a whole side. I mean, it's not just teaching classes, right? It's not just doing research. That's part of what being a history professor is, or archaeology, anthropology professor. That's part of the job, but that's not the only part of the job. Just like my job, that's the research and presenting at conferences is just a small part of it. Like I have administrative stuff I have to do too. Lecturers and adjuncts generally make a little less than that. Again, it kind of, but it's also going to kind of depend on where you're at and what university you're at and what state you're in. It's going to vary. So, really in the state of Florida for research associates, that's probably accurate is mid 40s to mid 60s is the range.
So before we wrap up, was there anything today that we haven't discussed that you would like to let listeners know about?
Maybe just a little bit more about the Florida Public Archaeology Network. So, like I said, we are the Florida Public Archaeology Network. We are incredibly unique. There's nothing quite else like us in terms of, at least in the United States. We focus on public archaeology, but this will be our 20th year of existence. We've been around for 20 years now. And so what's really unique about us is that most of what we do is public outreach and education. So doing those public programs, different training opportunities, whether it's for, scuba divers through our Heritage Awareness diving seminar where we train scuba instructors how to also promote and protect shipwreck sites, for example, right? So when you become a diver, if you get a recreational diving certification, you do get a little bit about like importance of protecting corals and habitats and don't mess with the fish, but there's almost nothing on like shipwrecks and like why you shouldn't like rip parts of a shipwreck off and how that's actually damaging for future divers because it's an artificial reef essentially, right? And so that program is geared to dive instructors to get them to like understand and appreciate and teach why it's also important to protect underwater cultural heritage. But then we have other programs in our Cemetery Resource Protection Training, or CRIPT, where we train local groups or individuals how to properly care and maintain historic cemeteries, or what the laws are, or how to properly document and record cemeteries like that might be in a local area. Then we have our Heritage Monitoring Scouts program where we train citizen scientists how to actually go out and monitor. We're not collecting, we're not removing any artifacts. We're just documenting what's happening over time so we can prioritize which sites we need to maybe focus on, or land managers should keep an eye on, for example. So we do so much, but the whole field of public archaeology is not just talking to school groups. It's part of it. Public archaeology is engaging people in archaeology, anyone who's not a professional archaeologist. So it can be school kids, but it also can be state legislators. Mm-hmm. It can also be governors. It can also be different nonprofit organizations or local businesses or state parks or federal parks, right? There's so many different aspects of what we touch on. And that's really a lot of what we do is collaboration and partnerships with all these different entities and individuals who are really interested in their local history and really value it. And so we do a lot of different work throughout the state, but we are unique. There really isn't anything like us in terms of how it's structured and how it's funded, and what impact that we have had over the last 2 decades has really been phenomenal. And so I'm looking forward to, it's been amazing for me. You know, I started almost 20 years ago working at a small museum, and now I work for a university that has a statewide presence. I've had the opportunity to work on lots of really interesting projects throughout my career, from writing episodes for Unearthing Florida that still airs on our local NPR station, 88.1 WWF, every morning at 7:33 a.m. So I had an opportunity to write a lot of those scripts. But I've also gotten to work on like amazing projects, not just here in the state of Florida, but I've even had the opportunity to work on international projects. It's an amazing field that's really grown. I mean, when I started 20 years ago, you know, when you said public archaeology, it's kind of like, it wasn't real archaeology, right? It was kind of the mentality of some professional archaeologists who I know and I still know. But I think that's really changed. And I think the value for doing public archaeology is much more appreciated now than it ever has been, at least since I've been in the field. It's amazing how much this field has grown. I think it's going to continue to grow. I'm excited for the future generations to come in with new ideas, not just for museums, but also public archaeology. And so we've got a lot of work to do. There's a lot that we can do. There's a lot that needs to be done, but I'm excited to see how it continues to grow and change, and try to grow and change with it.
That's amazing. So our last final 4 questions that I ask all of my guests: what's the best piece of advice you can offer to someone who wants to get into museum work or archaeology?
Network. Yeah. Get to know people. So my first job came from networking, right? I went out to local museums and just talked to people, had face-to-face. So that way, when I applied, they knew who I was already. If you're in the university, right? If, you know, get to know your professors, they can open so many doors, right? I mean, part of it is you got to do good work, right? You got to study hard. You got to get good grades, but that's only part of it. The other part of it is who you know and who can open doors for you. With that said, it's not just your professors. It's not just like getting to volunteering or trying to, you know, get your foot in the door at small museums. Don't just think about large institutions. You know, do a year or 2 at a small place. You're going to get so much more experience at a small museum than you ever will at a larger museum. The pay is terrible. Like, believe me, I worked for local government for 4 years. I know the pains of that, but you can get a lot of experience doing that. So, you know, just because it's a smaller museum, there's a lot of value there. There's a lot you can learn by working at those places, by getting your foot in the door, but also not just like, you know, getting to know your professors, but if you have the opportunity to go to professional conferences, do that. There are funding sources available for graduate students out there through the different departments, through the College of Arts and Sciences. They have grant opportunities, you know, and don't just think large conferences are great. And you can really, you know, you can get to know and network a lot of different people there that can help open up doors for you when you're ready to actually try to get a job in the field. But also smaller conferences can be just as valuable. Go to those conferences, present your research, go to the bar afterwards and say hi to people in the field. What I've found is that the kind of figures that you're reading about in class, I used to read all these different books by all these different professors through other universities that I'd cite all the time. And I always thought that there was these larger than life figures, right? But they're just people. So just network. But then also the final advice I have for that networking, because I really do believe it's super important, is your peers in class are just as important as any professor or as any other professional within the field that you network or meet with through conferences as anybody else, because they will help open doors for you as well. You know, the worst thing you can do is look at each other as competition. The best thing you can do is look at each other as people you can partner with and collaborate with. Because, you know, I remember grad students just starting out when I started are now like professors at universities, are now like some of the like leading experts in like underwater heritage, right? For cultural resource management firms, or they're working for the National Park Service. Like, I have so many examples of people who came through our program who are now like leading, right, the field. And so your peers are just as important as your professors. So be nice, make friends, and do good work. That's my best advice.
Yep. They're basically your future colleagues as well.
They are 100%. They are your future colleagues.
Yeah. So next question is, what changes do you wish to see in the field of archaeology or museum studies?
Yeah, I think, one of the big changes that we're starting to see is focusing on untold stories, is, making sure that we're engaging a much more diverse audience, right? I mean, it's important that we're telling stories that haven't been told for, many times purposely, right? Whether it's people of African descent, indigenous communities, it's important that we not only engage these communities and help to tell those stories, but then we're also asking those communities what they value. And so that, and working with them, and not just like telling them what they need to do, but listening to them and seeing what their needs are and trying to meet those needs. So, really within the last couple of years, this has been more of the dialogue. It's important, accessibility is super important, but also making sure that we're not only engaging these different communities, in all communities that we have within whatever museum you're working at, is engaging all the communities, but then also making sure that we provide access to these different communities, these diverse communities, so they can get into the field, so they can make changes, so they can have an impact. And so I think we're starting to see more of that. Still have some of the same old challenges that we've always had that we're going to continue having to work on. Looting is still a huge problem throughout the country, but especially in Florida. And so educating younger people, younger audiences is, I still think, a very important thing that we need to do. So engaging with school communities, and again, all school communities, making sure that we're getting into community centers, right? Yeah, we're going to face a lot of challenges, but I think for me, one of the most important ones is that we continue in that effort to make sure that our field is not only helping to tell these untold stories, but also to make sure that we reflect what our communities actually look like.
And everybody's favorite question, what do you love about your job?
I love that every day is a little bit different. And that can be a day-to-day thing. Sometimes I have on my, I have this schedule, right? But I have no idea what phone call I'm going to get later today. But then just always having different projects come up and programs that we're able to kind of create, build new things, and change programs or projects over time is what I really love about this job. And the fact that I get to do something that I'm passionate about. I've always, since I was a little kid, I've always been interested in history and archaeology. And the fact that I get to talk to people about it every day in some capacity is great. I never get tired of it. I've never lost that passion. But also, I love getting to get out into the field. I love, working in the archives. I love, interacting with museum guests as they come in, or being creative, working on museum exhibits or creating digital content to teach people about these resources is why I love this job ever.
That's amazing. Yeah. So finally, where can listeners learn more about you and or the work that you do?
Yeah, the best place to go is if you go to our website, fpan.us. You can find all about the Florida Public Archaeology Network and all the programs and events and projects that we have going on, not just here in Pensacola, but throughout the entire state. Also, my contact information is on there. So my email, my phone, best way to contact me, honestly, is through email. But then also I do have an academia page. So if you wanted to go check out some of the articles I've written, you can find those on there. And yeah, that's really the best way to find out more information. Like I said, you all are the future. You all one day could become my boss. Who knows, right? So I'm always happy to help however I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and talking about this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again for thinking of me. And I look forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Anthropuzzled. This show was produced by me. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website and episode descriptions, and to Leah Akers for the incredible logo design. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound of Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letsinger@anthropuzzled.com. That's abby.letsinger@anthropuzzled.com. Or as Anthropuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, or YouTube. Until next time.